The donor packet vanished at 4:17 a.m., and Harrison Vance knew exactly which fluorescent-lit corridor it had traveled before disappearing. He stood motionless in the mail cage, hands still gripping a crate of press releases, watching the security monitor flicker with a 3-second gap that shouldn't exist. The building slept above him, penthouse suites where 7-figure donations were negotiated over single malt scotch, and this sub-basement where overnight workers earned just enough to choose between rent and medicine. Harrison didn't flinch when the elevator chimed. He had been waiting 3 years for something like this to surface. What he hadn't calculated was Sienna Ashcroft, exhausted, brilliant, drowning in law school debt, spotting the same anomaly from the legal floor above, her eyes meeting his through the reinforced glass as both realized they were hunting the same ghost. By noon, the newsroom would stage a press conference to name a scapegoat. By midnight, someone would have to choose between love and the only truth that mattered. What happens when the poorest person in the building holds the richest secret? When survival means destroying the only person who saw you clearly? This isn't a story about heroes. It's about who gets believed when the cameras turn on. The pre-dawn scramble began with a beep that didn't belong to any authorized scanner. Harrison froze, his cart of morning editions halfway between the loading dock and the elevator bank. The sound came from the north stairwell, where donor packets never travel, too valuable for stairs, too tracked for shadows. He counted to 30, protocol drilled into him from somewhere he never discussed, then moved. The fluorescent lights hummed their cheap song above crates labeled priority and confidential, but the gap on shelf 7D told him what he needed. Someone had beaten him to the 6 a.m. editorial meeting materials. Someone with access codes that cost more than his annual salary. He didn't report it. That was the first deviation from his script in 3 years of invisible labor. Instead, Harrison photographed the empty space with a phone he paid for in installments, noting the scuff marks that suggested expensive shoes, Italian leather, size 11, the kind worn in the penthouse lounge where donors discussed press freedom over canapes. The kind Porter Kincaid wore to every public appearance. By 5:30, Harrison had returned to his route, face neutral, hands steady, but something had shifted in the building's gravity. The missing packet contained more than donation figures. It contained signatures that could redraw ownership of stories themselves. And Harrison, who knew every blind spot in the security grid, understood that his careful invisibility had just become a liability. What else had he missed while pretending to be merely poor and powerless? What had he sacrificed to maintain that disguise? The morning editorial meeting would convene in 90 minutes with a hole at its center, and Harrison Vance, overnight delivery worker, Sharpied ghost, man with a calendar in his head that matched no schedule in H, would be the only person who knew exactly how much damage that hole could cause. He thought of Sienna then, though he had no right to. She would be arriving soon, her second-hand coat against the October chill, her eyes already scanning for the legal notes that others missed. Would she see what he saw? Or would she see only what they wanted her to see? The question felt like a door opening in a house he had boarded up long ago. Sienna Ashcroft found the anomaly at 6:45 a.m., buried in what her supervisor called routine contract maintenance. She read it twice, then a third time, her coffee cooling in the break room where the vending machine ate quarters and the microwave smelled of burnt popcorn. The note redefined ownership of the investigative series that had defined the outlet's reputation. A single clause, inserted between standard indemnification language, transferred final editorial approval to the donor advisory board for any story involving funding entities or their affiliates. She knew the affiliates. Everyone on the legal floor knew them, though no one spoke their names above a whisper. They were the reason her student loans remained a mountain, the reason she worked 60-hour weeks on a salary that qualified her for food assistance. Sienna looked up from the document and saw Harrison passing in the hallway below, his cart stacked with the morning's first deliveries. Their eyes met through the glass partition, a glance that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but contained an entire conversation. He looked away first, but not before she saw something that didn't fit his uniform: recognition. Not flotation. Recognition of the document in her hands, or of the weight it carried, or of something larger she couldn't yet name. She folded the note into her pocket, heart hammering, and made a decision that would define the next 48 hours. She would not report the anomaly upward. Not yet. Not until she understood why a delivery worker looked at her with the eyes of someone who had already read what she was reading. The break room's fluorescent lights flickered, and Sienna realized she was choosing between her career and something she couldn't yet articulate. What if the poorest person in the building knew more than the attorneys billing $400 an hour? What if her exhaustion, her genuine, bone-deep exhaustion, was being weaponized against her? She thought of her loans, her mother's medical bills, the tiny apartment she could barely afford. Then she thought of Harrison's hands on his cart, steady despite everything, and the question became unavoidable. When survival depends on not seeing, what does it cost to finally look? The editorial meeting had begun upstairs, loud with voices that never worried about rent, and Sienna Ashcroft Jr., paralegal, principled, terrified, suddenly awake, walked toward the stairs instead of the conference room. She needed to know what Harrison Vance knew, and why he had been waiting for someone to notice. Porter Kincaid announced the record donation at 10:15 a.m. from the penthouse conference room, his Italian leather shoes gleaming against the marble floor that had never known a scuff mark. $3 million for press freedom initiatives, he declared, his voice carrying the warmth of a man who had never worried about a utility bill. The cameras loved him, the silver at his temples, the bespoke suit that cost more than Harrison's annual wages, the practiced sincerity that made exploitation sound like charity. But Sienna, watching from the back of the room where staff crowded standing grummanly, saw the transaction beneath the performance. Porter's eyes found the editor-in-chief with the precision of a contract clause. The headline was already written in that glance: Donor Fund enables groundbreaking investigation. What the glance didn't say, but what Sienna now understood from her morning discovery, was the codicil subject to advisory board approval on all funding-related content. She looked for Harrison and found him in the far corner, delivering water to a table of executives who didn't see him. His posture was perfect: invisibility, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes on his cart, a man who had mastered the art of being furniture. But she noticed his hands. They had stopped moving. He was listening to every word, and something in his stillness suggested he was comparing this speech to another version, one that existed only in his memory or his evidence. Porter concluded with a flourish, promising unprecedented transparency in donor relationships. The room applauded. Sienna did not. She was watching Harrison watch Porter, and the recognition in his face was not surprise, it was confirmation of a timeline he had already mapped. The poorest worker in the room knew something the wealthiest donor didn't know he knew. The inversion felt dangerous, electric, like standing in water during a storm. Afterward, Porter found her near the elevators. His smile remained, but his voice dropped to a register that carried no warmth at all. Sienna. I hear you've been reviewing contract language. Careful eyes are valuable here. But curiosity without context can look like interference. He touched her shoulder, the grip light but present, and she understood that her morning's discovery had not been as private as she believed. The fund protects journalists, he continued. We protect the fund. It's a chain of custody, really. You understand custody, don't you? Legal custody, financial custody, moral custody. He released her and walked away, leaving Sienna with the certainty that her choices had already narrowed to two: complicity or destruction. What did it mean that the man with everything already feared the woman with nothing? What did Harrison's stillness in that corner suggest about how long this had been happening? She found him in the mailroom at noon, breaking protocol, and asked the question that would bind them together. How many versions of that speech have you heard? He didn't deny knowing. He simply said, enough to know which one they'll print. Then he handed her a routing slip stamped, dated, coded in a system she didn't recognize, and walked away before she could ask what department archival recovery served in a building that had no archives. Harrison found the two memos at 2:30 a.m., during his second pass through the executive floor. The first was standard issue donor acknowledgement, quarterly review, the kind of document that accumulated in trays until someone filed it away unread. The second was identical in every visible particular except one: the timestamp. 14 hours later than the first, stamped with the same authorization code, but carrying a single altered paragraph that redirected $50,000 to narrative consultation services. He photographed both with the steady hands of someone who had done this before, who had been trained for this, whose past contained skills that didn't match his present poverty. The discrepancy was subtle enough to miss if you weren't looking for it, obvious enough to destroy careers if you were. Harrison sat in the darkened mail cage, surrounded by the hum of refrigerators and the distant thrum of the building's climate control, and felt the old calculation return. 3 years he had worked this job, 3 years of being unseen, 3 years of waiting for the document that would connect past to present. Now he had 2 documents, and they pointed to a pattern. The narrative consultation line item appeared in 3 previous quarters, always inserted in late stamped versions, always approved by signatures that matched no active personnel files. He cross-referenced against his mental calendar dates when stories had been killed, when reporters had been reassigned, when the advisory board had met in emergency session. The correlation was absolute. Someone was buying silence with donor money, and someone else was creating the paper trail to make it look like standard operations. Harrison thought of Sienna, of the routing slip he had given her, of the risk he had taken in that single gesture. He was compromising his mission for a woman he barely knew, and the worst part was that he couldn't determine if this was weakness or humanity returning. The building's night security made their rounds at 3 a.m. Harrison greeted them with the same nod he always offered, the invisible man's acknowledgement, and returned to his sorting. But his mind was racing through scenarios he had promised himself he wouldn't rehearse until the evidence was complete. What if he showed her everything? What if she was the ally he had stopped believing existed? What if she was the trap that would finally close? The 2 memos sat in his locker, separated by 14 hours and a world of intention, and Harrison Vance, delivery worker, witness, man with a hidden calendar that marked anniversaries of injustice, made a decision that would accelerate everything. He would bring her the second memo. He would trust her exhausted eyes to see what his trained ones had found. And he would do it knowing that trust was the most dangerous variable in an equation he had spent years solving for revenge. What happened when the scapegoat needed another scapegoat to survive? What happened when the invisible man chose to be seen? The press conference began at 11 a.m. in the newsroom itself, a violation of every firewall principle that supposedly protected editorial independence. Porter Kincaid had arranged it this way: cameras in the bullpen, reporters at their desks becoming props in their own humiliation. Sienna felt it before she understood it, the shift in atmosphere when executive assistants began clearing paths and the lighting crew adjusted for broadcast rather than work. She was at her station, reviewing the altered memo Harrison had slipped her at dawn, when her supervisor's voice came over the intercom with a tone she had never heard before. All legal staff to the central floor. Immediate. The walk felt like a funeral procession. She saw Harrison in the crowd of low-wage workers gathered at the edges, his cart abandoned, his face arranged in the same neutral mask as everyone who survived by not being noticed. But his eyes found hers, and the message in them was clear: this is what they do. This is the machine. Porter stood at a podium bearing the outlet's logo, the donor fund's logo, the seamless merger of journalism and patronage that had become invisible through repetition. He began with praise our dedicated legal team and pivoted with the grace of a man who had practiced this pivot in mirrors. However, recent irregularities in document handling have compromised a sensitive donor relationship. The cameras turned. Not to Porter. To Sienna. "Ms. Ashcroft, would you step forward?" She moved without choosing to, her body betraying her mind's scream to run. Porter held a document, her document, the routing slip Harrison had given her, now presented as evidence of unauthorized access to archival systems. This junior paralegal, he announced to the cameras, to the live stream, to the permanent record, tampered with chain of custody protocols in a manner that suggests either gross negligence or deliberate sabotage. The word sabotage echoed. Sienna felt her face burn, felt the eyes of colleagues who had shared vending machine dinners now seeing her as threat, as incompetent, as the reason their jobs might vanish. Porter detailed her student debt public record, now weaponized, suggesting financial pressure as motive. He referenced her unusual interest in donor contract language, reframing her morning's discovery as obsession rather than duty. The fund demands accountability, he concluded, and the room understood that accountability meant Sienna Ashcroft would never work in journalism again. She looked for Harrison and couldn't find him. The crowd had shifted, or he had moved, or the cameras had simply erased the poor from the frame as they always did. Porter offered a performance of mercy. "We will not pursue legal action at this time," that sealed her guilt in the language of forgiveness. The press conference ended. The news cycle began. And Sienna stood in the center of the room where she had dreamed of justice, wearing the costume of public humiliation that would follow her home, to her family, to every future job interview, wondering if Harrison had known this would happen, if he had led her here, if love or whatever they had been building in stolen hallway moments had always been a setup. What did it mean to be destroyed in public by the same system that promised to protect the truth? What did survival look like when your reputation was the price of someone else's narrative? Porter found her in the parking garage at 7 p.m., when the humiliated are supposed to have already left, already surrendered, already accepted the terms of their erasure. Sienna's car wouldn't start later. She would wonder if that was coincidence, and she was standing beside it, staring at the concrete wall where someone had painted over graffiti about worker rights, when his limousine blocked her escape. The window descended with hydraulic whisper. "Get in, Sienna. We need to discuss forgiveness." The interior smelled of leather and power, the seats warmed by elements she couldn't afford to replace in her own vehicle. Porter sat across from her, not beside, maintaining the distance of judge to petitioner. He spoke of reputational management, of narrative rehabilitation, of the fund's capacity to make stories disappear or reappear according to need. "You have a choice," he said, and his voice carried the warmth of a contract clause. "We can escalate. Legal review of every document you've touched in 18 months. Character testimony from colleagues who noticed your fixations. A full audit of your student loan applications, perhaps. Or..." He paused, letting the silence work. "You can help us understand Harrison Vance." Sienna's heart became a trapped thing. She had not mentioned Harrison. She had not connected him to anything in the public record of her humiliation. Yet Porter knew, and his knowing was itself a threat. "The overnight worker," Porter continued, "who has been unusually attentive to donor materials. Who has a history we can't quite trace. Who seems to appear in security gaps with remarkable consistency." He handed her a tablet displaying Harrison's personnel file, sparse, suspicious, full of holes that only money could create in an employment record. "We believe he's the source of certain leaks. We believe he's been cultivating you as..." What? An ally? A distraction? A future scapegoat when his own exposure came? Porter's smile was surgical. "Tell us what he's told you. Tell us what he's shown you. In return, we issue a statement clarifying your role." Heroic, actually, a whistleblower who tried to stop him. "Your debt becomes manageable. Your career survives. Your mother's medical bills." He let the sentence hang, incomplete, devastating. Sienna thought of Harrison's hands on the routing slip, steady despite everything. She thought of his eyes in the mail cage, seeing her truly when no one else had bothered to look. Love, or its beginning, had been the only true thing in her months of exhaustion. Now it was currency. Now it was the price of her resurrection. "You have until morning," Porter said, as the limousine glided back to the executive entrance. "Consider which story you want to belong to. The woman who was fooled by a saboteur. Or the woman who helped stop him." Sienna sat in her dead car for an hour after he left, watching the garage's fluorescent lights buzz their cheap song. What did it cost to betray someone who had trusted you first? What did it cost to be loyal to someone who might have been using you all along? The question Harrison represented truth or convenience, justice or survival had become her own, and the morning would demand an answer that would define whatever remained of her life. Harrison waited in the mail cage, knowing she would come, knowing she might come to destroy him. The moral test had arrived ahead of schedule, forced by Porter's acceleration of the timeline. He had prepared for this moment for 3 years, rehearsed it in the dark hours between delivery routes, built his identity around the certainty that he would sacrifice anything for the truth that had been denied to others. Now he held two versions of a memo that could collapse the fund's narrative, and he held the memory of Sienna's face during the press conference, shocked, burning, betrayed by the system he had allowed her to enter without sufficient warning. She appeared at midnight, her coat pulled tight, her eyes carrying the weight of the limousine's offer. Harrison didn't speak. He placed the memos on the sorting table between them, the early stamp and the late stamp, the innocent version and the corrupted one. "The fund buys stories," he said, his voice lower than the refrigerator hum. "Not just kills them. Redirects them. The narrative consultation line is a slush fund for friendly coverage. I've tracked 12 quarters. I've matched the deposits to story shifts. I have the original approval signatures." Sienna looked at the documents, then at him, and he saw her calculating the same calculation he had made years ago when choosing between safety and witness. "Porter offered me my life back," she said, and the honesty felt like a blade between them. "He wants you. He wants to know what you know, who you've told, where the originals are." Harrison nodded, unsurprised, his face revealing nothing of the collapse happening inside. "And what did you decide?" She didn't answer directly. She touched the late stamped memo, her finger tracing the altered paragraph. "This would end my career. Even if it's true. Especially if it's true." She looked up, and her exhaustion was visible now, the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting longer than anyone knew. "Why me? Why show me this? You could have gone to any reporter. Any attorney with actual power. Why a junior paralegal who can't pay her loans?" The question he had refused to answer, even to himself. Harrison felt the old walls cracking, the identity he had constructed from grief and rage beginning to show its foundations. "Because you saw," he said, the words coming slowly, each one a risk. "In the hallway. That first morning. You saw what was actually there, not what you were supposed to see. I've been waiting 3 years for someone who still knew how to look." He paused, the next sentence requiring more than he had given to anyone. "And because I couldn't survive being invisible to the only person I wanted to see me." The confession hung between them, terrible and tender, the truth that made everything more dangerous. Sienna's choice was no longer abstract. If she took Porter's offer, Harrison would be destroyed, as evidence seized, his identity exposed, his 3 years of preparation dismantled by the testimony of the woman he had trusted. If she refused, she would remain destroyed, her public humiliation permanent, her future compressed to survival. What did it mean to love someone when loving them might kill them? What did justice require when the cost was the only heart that had recognized your own? Harrison watched her decide, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt the full weight of the poverty he had chosen, not financial, but emotional, the poverty of having built a life around revenge and finding it insufficient. The planted email thread appeared at 6 a.m., distributed to all department heads with the efficiency of a system that had done this before. It showed Sienna requesting access to restricted donor files, her language urgent, her tone suggesting desperation. It showed her meeting with Harrison in the mailroom, timestamp suggesting conspiracy rather than coincidence. It showed the poorest staff, the overnight workers, the cleaning crew, the contract paralegals, careless with protocols, as susceptible to corruption, as fundamentally untrustworthy with the responsibilities that wealth had reserved for itself. Harrison read it on a break room monitor, surrounded by colleagues who suddenly saw him as threat rather than furniture. The emails were fabrications, he knew immediately, language patterns slightly off, header metadata that wouldn't survive technical scrutiny, but they didn't need to survive. They needed to exist long enough to harden the narrative, to make Sienna's humiliation seem like precedent rather than exception, to transform the building's poorest workers into a class of suspects. He found Marcus from loading dock security already packing his locker, tears on a face that had never shown weakness. "They said I let you through after hours," Marcus whispered. "I never did. But they have logs that say I did. Logs I can't afford to challenge." The mechanism was clear now. Porter wasn't just protecting the fund, he was demonstrating its power to manufacture reality. The planted details were precise enough to suggest insider knowledge, vague enough to resist disproof, devastating enough to make resistance seem futile. Harrison helped Marcus carry his box to the exit, both men understanding that this was a preview of Harrison's own departure. The email thread had been seeded with references to Harrison's unusual interest in specific donor names that connected to the original cover-up he had been tracking, names that no overnight worker should recognize. Someone in the fund's architecture knew, or suspected, that his presence in this building was not accidental. The question was how much they knew, and whether they understood the depth of what he had already documented. Sienna found him at the loading dock, her face showing the same shock he had seen in Marcus. "They're saying I sold access," she said, her voice hollow. "That my debt made me vulnerable to recruitment. That you approached me with money." The narrative was perfect in its cruelty, poverty as moral failing, financial pressure as motive for treason, the romance they had barely begun transformed into transaction. "We need to separate," Harrison said, the words costing him more than any physical blow. "If they see us together, it confirms their story. If we operate alone, we might survive long enough to prove the truth." Sienna's eyes filled with the understanding that he was protecting her by pushing her away, and the grief that such protection was itself a form of loss. "They want me to testify against you," she said. "Formal deposition. Legal intimidation dressed as cooperation." Harrison nodded, having expected this, having prepared for it without believing it would arrive. "Don't refuse yet. Let them think you're considering. It buys time." Time for what, he didn't say. Time for the sealed envelope he had found. Time for the identity he had kept hidden to finally serve its purpose. But standing at the loading dock, watching Marcus drive away from a job he needed to survive, Harrison felt the weight of the moral test he had designed for himself. He had wanted to expose the fund's corruption. He had not wanted to destroy innocent people in the process. Yet the machine he was fighting made no such distinctions, and his careful planning was now collateral damage in a war he had started. What did it mean that his truth required others' suffering? What did survival look like when the only path forward was paved with more betrayals? Sienna risked everything at 2 a.m., using credentials that would be revoked by morning to access the donation approval database. The system was under maintenance, which meant someone was scrubbing records, but maintenance created gaps, and gaps were where truth survived. She traced the fund's quarterly reports backward through 3 years, matching the narrative consultation line items to specific story outcomes. The correlation was mathematical, undeniable, and legally explosive. Each consultation deposit preceded a killed investigation or a redirected headline by an average of 11 days. The pattern was too consistent for coincidence, too systematic for individual corruption. This was architecture, designed into the fund's operating principles, hidden behind the language of press freedom and donor protection. She photographed screens with her phone, knowing the metadata would mark her, knowing that capture was likely, choosing to continue because the alternative was permanent submission to the lie. Harrison had gone cold in the days since the loading dock. No hallway glances, no routing slips, no acknowledgement in crowded elevators. She understood the strategy. She hated it. The absence of his presence felt like a new form of poverty, an impoverishment she hadn't known was possible until she experienced its opposite. At 3:30, she found the approval chain for the current quarter's consultation deposit. It required 3 signatures: Porter's, the editor-in-chief's, and a third she didn't recognize, a name that appeared only in these documents, attached to no public biography, existing only in the fund's sealed records. She searched for correlations, found none in the staff directory, found something else instead. The name matched a signature on Harrison's original employment authorization, dated 3 years prior. The discovery stopped her breathing. Not because it proved conspiracy, though it suggested connection, but because it suggested Harrison had been inside this system before she knew him, before anyone knew him as delivery worker, before the identity he wore had been constructed. What had he been? What was he still? The questions multiplied as she copied files, as she felt the building's security systems adjusting around her unauthorized presence. Harrison's coldness was protection, but protection of what? Of her. Of himself? Of a truth that required his continued invisibility? She left the database at 415, returning to her desk to find her access already suspended, her supervisor waiting with security escort. The timing was precise. Someone had monitored her intrusion, allowed it to proceed, cut it off at the moment of maximum exposure. Ms. Ashcroft, her supervisor said, and the formality was itself a condemnation, you're to accompany these officers for questioning regarding unauthorized access to confidential financial records. Sienna stood, thinking of Harrison's hands on the cart, steady despite everything. She had the truth in her phone, and they would take it, and she would have nothing. Unless Harrison's coldness was not abandonment but preparation. Unless the sealed envelope he had mentioned was already in motion. Unless the identity he hid was the key to everything she had just found. What did it mean to trust someone you could no longer see? What did justice require when the witness had gone deeper underground than the crime? Porter tightened control with the precision of a man who had never lost a game he controlled the rules of. Access revoked for Sienna, schedules changed for Harrison, moved to day shift where he could be observed, surrounded by supervisors who reported to the fund's security consultant. Security logs were edited to show his presence in restricted areas, creating a trail of violations that would justify termination without reference to any actual misconduct. The building became a panopticon, and the poorest workers learned again that survival meant visibility when observed, invisibility when not. Harrison performed his new role with the skill of someone who had trained for theater before training for law. He made errors minor, plausible, the kind that suggested stress rather than sabotage. He arrived late, left early, sorted incorrectly, became the unreliable worker that Porter's narrative required. All the while, he was mapping the new security patterns, identifying the gaps that desperation creates, maintaining the network of low-wage workers who saw everything and were believed about nothing. The sealed envelope remained in his locker, unopened, waiting for the moment when its contents would have maximum impact. He had found it 3 weeks prior, misdelivered to the mail cage, addressed to a department that didn't exist in any organizational chart. The routing code matched no active protocol. The seal was government grade, the kind used for witness protection materials or sealed court filings. He had photographed the exterior, researched the coding, confirmed what he suspected but couldn't yet prove. Now, with Sienna silenced and himself surveilled, the envelope became his only remaining asset. Its existence suggested that someone else was investigating the fund, someone with federal credentials, someone who had chosen this building as a point of contact. Harrison's hidden identity, the truth he had guarded through 3 years of poverty performance, was connected to this envelope. He had been a prosecutor once, before the case that had destroyed his faith in public justice, before the witness he had protected had been killed despite protection, before he had chosen to become the protection himself. The fund's original cover-up had involved that death, a journalist who had found the donation manipulation, who had been silenced not through legal means but through an accident that Harrison had never believed was accidental. He had taken this job to find the connection, to become the chain of custody that the system had broken, to deliver the truth that courts had failed to deliver. Now the envelope suggested that someone else had continued the investigation he had abandoned, that his solitary quest had been less solitary than he knew. What did it mean to discover that your isolation was shared? What did survival look like when the cavalry arrived disguised as misdelivered mail? Harrison worked his day shift, playing the incompetent worker, waiting for the moment when the envelope's contents could be released without destroying the network of poor, invisible witnesses he had built around himself. The moral test had evolved. It was no longer truth versus convenience. It was truth versus the survival of those who had trusted him with their own small rebellions. Harrison opened the sealed envelope at 11 p.m., in the mail cage where he had first found it, using techniques he hadn't employed in 3 years but hadn't forgotten. The contents were explosive in their quietness: a federal prosecutor certification, a witness statement from the journalist's former editor, and a chain of custody log connecting the fund's narrative consultation deposits to specific acts of intimidation, including the accident that had killed Harrison's original witness. The editor's statement named names. Porter's name appeared 12 times. The pattern was documented with the precision that only federal resources could achieve, suggesting an investigation that had been running parallel to Harrison's own, invisible to him until this moment. But the most devastating page was the last current employment authorization for Harrison Vance, issued by the same prosecutor's office, classifying him as embedded investigative personnel with a reporting date 3 years prior. His hidden identity, the truth he had guarded even from Sienna, was now in his hands in documentary form. He had not known he was still official. He had believed himself abandoned by the system he had tried to serve, a rogue agent operating without sanction. The envelope proved otherwise. He was still a prosecutor. He was still protected. He was still part of a chain of custody that had never broken, only gone underground. The implications staggered him. Every document he had collected, every risk he had taken, every poverty he had endured, they were not merely personal vengeance. They were evidence in an active federal case. His testimony would be admissible. His provenance was established. The fund's architecture could be dismantled not through the exposure he had planned, but through the legal mechanisms he had stopped believing in. Harrison sat with this knowledge until the cage's fluorescent lights flickered their morning warning. He thought of Sienna, suspended, silenced, believing herself abandoned. He could now save her through official channels, restore her reputation through prosecutorial intervention, transform her from scapegoat to cooperating witness with a single phone call. But that phone call would end his presence in her life. The identity he revealed would be the identity that separated them, prosecutor and victim, official and civilian, the class distinctions that his poverty performance had temporarily erased. What did it mean to finally have power and discover it cost the only relationship that had made power meaningful? What did justice require when the legal path and the personal path diverged so absolutely? Harrison made his choice at dawn, but not the choice the envelope suggested. He would not call the number provided. He would not activate his official status. He would use the documents to create a different kind of custody, one that protected Sienna without requiring her to become a witness, one that destroyed Porter without requiring Harrison to become a prosecutor again. The sealed envelope had given him the tools. His own hands would determine how they were used. The donor list updated overnight, a routine administrative procedure that removed 3 names and added 7. Sienna saw it from her apartment, using a colleague's borrowed credentials, her own access still suspended. The vanished names belonged to donors who had asked questions about the consultation line items, about the advisory board's composition, about why their contributions seemed to purchase less influence than promised. Their removal was technically voluntary, philanthropic redirection, but the timing was surgical. Each had raised concerns within 48 hours of disappearing from the list. Each had received personal visits from Porter's outreach team before their departure. The pattern was clear: the fund didn't just buy narratives, it bought silence from its own supporters, transforming donors into witnesses and witnesses into amnesiacs. Sienna photographed the changes, cross-referenced against her own database of concerns, built a map of fear that matched Harrison's map of corruption. She had not heard from him in 9 days. The silence felt like confirmation of everything Porter had suggested: that she had been used, that her trust had been currency, that the romance she had imagined was merely operational. Yet she continued her investigation, not for Harrison but for herself, for the person she had been before the public humiliation, the person who believed that seeing clearly was still possible even when looking cost everything. The new donors replacing the vanished ones shared characteristics: wealth from industries under regulatory threat, foundations with opaque funding sources, individuals with histories of using philanthropy to manage reputational crises. They were not buying press freedom, they were buying insurance against exposure. And they were paying premium rates for the guarantee that the outlet would never investigate them. Sienna traced one new donor to a shell company connected to the original cover-up. Harrison had mentioned the death of the journalist, the accident that wasn't accidental. The connection was tenuous, a shared address on incorporation documents, but it suggested that the fund's current operations were not merely corrupt but were actively covering for past crimes. She prepared a memo, knowing it would be intercepted, knowing that its existence would be used against her, choosing to write it anyway because the act of documentation was itself resistance. At 3 a.m., her doorbell rang. Not Harrison. A courier with a package she hadn't ordered, containing documents she recognized Harrison's handwriting on routing slips she had seen before, now arranged in chronological sequence that told a story. The story was his investigation, his evidence, his 3 years of work, presented without commentary, without request, without the protection of his presence. He was giving her everything, and the giving was itself a message. He could not be seen with her. He could not explain. But he could ensure she had the tools to survive without him. What did it mean to receive love as evidence, intimacy as documentation? What did survival look like when the person who had seen you clearly was forcing you to see yourself alone? Sienna found the leaked memo at 4 a.m., in the package Harrison had sent, buried beneath the routing slips and security logs. It was the original, the source, the document that had started everything, the journalist's final story, killed before publication, preserved somehow in Harrison's chain of custody. The memo detailed the fund's creation, its true purpose as a mechanism for narrative acquisition, its early success in silencing investigations through strategic donation rather than legal challenge. The journalist had found the pattern in its infancy, had documented the first consultation deposits, had named the advisory board members who were not journalists but industry representatives with specific interests in specific outcomes. Reading it, Sienna understood why the journalist had died. The memo was not merely embarrassing, it was criminal. It proved intent to obstruct justice, to manipulate markets, to destroy reputations through manufactured scandal. And it proved that the fund's current operations were the continuation of a conspiracy that had begun before most current employees were hired. But the memo's chain of custody was booby-trapped. Harrison's documentation showed it changing hands 7 times in 3 years, each transfer marked by a security incident, a personnel change, a routine audit that removed the previous custodian. The pattern was clear: whoever held the memo was targeted for destruction. The journalist had died. An archivist had been fired for embezzlement. A lawyer had been disbarred for substance abuse. The memo was not just evidence, it was a weapon that destroyed its wielders. Harrison had held it for 6 months, longer than any previous custodian, through the discipline of invisibility, the protection of poverty, the refusal to be seen as a threat. Now he had passed it to Sienna, and the transfer was itself a test. Would she recognize the trap? Would she understand that using the memo required more than Kurgite, required a strategy for survival that no previous custodian had achieved? She studied his notes, his marginalia, the dates and connections he had drawn between the memo's transfers and the fund's retaliations. He had identified the pattern. He had prepared for it. He was offering her not just the truth but the methodology for surviving its revelation. The booby trap could be disarmed, but only by someone who understood that the fund's power was not in the memo itself but in the narrative control that made the memo unbelievable. Sienna needed to become credible before she became visible. She needed to establish her expertise, her reliability, her distance from the sabotage narrative Porter had constructed. She needed to become the kind of witness who could not be dismissed as desperate, indebted, professionally jealous. The work would take weeks. The memo's contents would not wait. What did it mean to hold truth that could kill you? What did survival look like when the only path forward was through the same system that had already destroyed you once? The key witness emerged at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, contacting Sienna through channels that suggested Harrison's arrangement: a prepaid phone, a public location, a recognition code from the documents he had sent. The witness was Marcus, the security guard Porter had destroyed in the email fabrication, now working parking enforcement for half his previous wage, carrying information that could redeem them both. He had kept logs. Personal logs, written in notebooks during his night shifts, documenting security exceptions that official records didn't show. Porter entering the building at 3 a.m. with individuals not on any donor list. The editing of surveillance footage, dates, times, the 3-second gaps that Harrison had also noticed. Most critically, Marcus had witnessed the original accident, the journalist's death, had seen the vehicle that struck her, had noted its license plate before being told by supervisors that his observation was mistaken, that the vehicle belonged to a different make, that his memory was unreliable. He had written it down before the intimidation could erase it. He had hidden the notebook where poverty teaches you to hide things beneath floorboards, behind water heaters, in spaces that wealth doesn't know exist. Marcus offered truth for a price, but the price was not money. It was protection. He had a daughter starting college, a wife with diabetes, a life that couldn't survive another destruction. He needed guarantee that his testimony would not make him the next scapegoat, the next embezzler, the next substance abuser removed from the record. Sienna listened to his conditions and understood the moral complexity Harrison had been navigating. Truth required witnesses, but witnesses required protection that the system refused to provide. The fund's power was not in silencing individuals but in demonstrating that testimony was suicide. To break that demonstration, Sienna needed to offer something Marcus couldn't get elsewhere: a path to survival that didn't depend on the fund's mercy or the legal system's sluggish justice. She thought of Harrison's envelope, the sealed mystery he had mentioned, the protection it might represent. She made promises she wasn't certain she could keep, based on faith in a man who had gone silent, trusting that his silence was strategy rather than abandonment. Marcus gave her the notebook. She gave him her phone number, her real one, the one that hadn't changed despite everything, the one that represented her refusal to become untraceable, unreachable, erasable. They parted in the parking garage where Porter's limousine had cornered her, the symmetry suggesting that locations carry memory, that returning to sites of humiliation could be reclamation. What did it mean to build a case from the wreckage of other lives? What did justice require when every witness was also a victim, and every victim needed more than truth to survive? The shock identity reveal arrived at 11 p.m., not through Harrison's confession but through Sienna's assembly of the evidence he had provided, the pieces clicking into a configuration that made the only hidden truth visible. The routing slips he had collected were not random documentation, they were a prosecutor's chain of custody, marked with case numbers that matched the sealed envelope certification. The security logs he had preserved showed his presence in restricted areas at times that corresponded to federal investigation protocols, not employee schedules. His unusual awareness of dates and approvals reflected training, not intuition. His restrained reactions to intimidation were professional discipline, not emotional guardedness. Harrison Vance was not merely a delivery worker with a mission. He was Assistant District Attorney Henry Vance, assigned 3 years prior to investigate the fund's connection to the journalist's death, embedded through an employment program that didn't exist in public records, operating under cover that had been maintained even when he believed himself abandoned by his own office. The sealed envelope proved with employment authorization, the prosecutorial certification, the witness protection protocols that had kept him alive when the journalist had died. Sienna found the signature match first. Harrison's daily logs, the ones he submitted to his supervisor, carried a distinctive compression in the H that matched case filings from the original investigation, available through public record databases she accessed from a library terminal. The planted details he had left for her to find the dates he remembered with precision, the legal terminology he used casually, the way he handled documents with the care of someone who knew they would be evidence. All of it was breadcrumb trail leading to this recognition. He had never told her because telling would have compromised the investigation, would have made her a co-conspirator in legal terms, would have subjected her to the same witness protection protocols that had isolated him. His poverty was performance, but his isolation was real. His guardedness was professional necessity, but his longing was genuine. He had fallen for her in stolen hallway moments, not despite his mission but because of it represented the normal life he had sacrificed, the honest work he had pretended to do, the clear eyes he had believed no longer existed in this corrupted building. The revelation should have felt like betrayal. It felt like relief. Sienna understood now why he had gone cold, why he had sent documents rather than appearing, why his protection of her had taken the form of absence. He was preparing to testify. He was preparing to reveal himself. He was preparing for the legal process that would transform him from witness to prosecutor, from invisible man to public figure, from Harrison to Henry, and in that transformation, he would lose the identity that had allowed them to meet as equals. What did it mean to love someone who had never been the person you loved? What did survival look like when the truth finally arrived dressed in the costume of your deepest fear? The public and legal power reversal began at 9 a.m., triggered by Sienna's release of the journalist's memo through a network of reporters outside the fund's influence, timed to coincide with Harrison's official emergence as prosecutor. The mechanism was elegant. The memo's provenance, established through Harrison's 3-year chain of custody, made it admissible in federal court. The fund's narrative consultation deposits, matched to specific story outcomes, constituted evidence of racketeering. Porter's personal involvement in the journalist's death, documented in Marcus' notebook and confirmed by Harrison's investigation, transformed the case from corruption to conspiracy. The advisory board's composition industry representatives rather than journalists proved intent to deceive donors about the fund's true purpose. The reversal was total, visible, irreversible. Porter's press conference, staged in the same newsroom where Sienna had been humiliated, became his own exposure. The cameras that had recorded her shame now recorded his arrest, the symmetry suggesting that justice, while slow, maintained a sense of narrative structure. The donor board, faced with criminal referral and regulatory investigation, dissolved rather than defend, its members claiming they had been misled about the fund's operations, their wealth suddenly insufficient to purchase immunity. Sienna testified as cooperating witness, her reputation restored not through Porter's mercy but through her own persistence, her public humiliation reframed as courageous resistance. She spoke of Harrison not as prosecutor, but as the man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had trusted her with truth when trust was most dangerous, who had taught her that poverty of position did not require poverty of vision. Harrison, or Henry, testified as lead investigator, his 3 years of embedded work finally visible, his identity transformation complete. He spoke of the journalist whose death had started his mission, of the witnesses who had risked everything to preserve truth, of the system that had failed to protect them until they protected themselves. The justice was real but incomplete. The fund collapsed, Porter faced trial, the advisory board's members faced civil suits. But the newsroom that had enabled the corruption remained, its structure unchanged, its hierarchy intact, its poverty and wealth still occupying separate floors. Sienna and Harrison met after the final hearing, in the parking garage where everything had begun, their identities transformed. She employed by a non-profit legal fund, he returned to prosecutorial service, both scarred by what they had endured. The romance that had grown in pressure survived in pressure's absence, but changed. They had learned to see each other through danger, and peace required learning to see anew. Harrison's hidden identity, once revealed, could not be hidden again. He would always be the man who had pretended to be poor, and Sienna would always be the woman who had loved the performance before knowing the performer. The emotional scar was this knowledge that trust had been necessary but incomplete, that intimacy had been real but constructed, that justice had been served but at costs that could not be calculated. They held hands in the garage, neither speaking, both understanding that survival was not victory and that love transformed was not love restored. What they had built in stolen moments and shared danger would require new architecture, honest construction, the slow work of becoming visible to each other without the pressure that had forced their recognition. The fund was gone. The truth was public. The poor and the powerful had reversed positions, temporarily, partially, incompletely. And two people who had found each other in the machinery of corruption stood in fluorescent light, choosing to begin again. The machinery of corruption doesn't break easily, it bends, it adapts, it finds new donors and new narratives to purchase. But for one moment, in one building, the poorest workers and the most exhausted professionals chose seeing over survival, and the choice became contagious. This story isn't about heroes in capes, it's about heroes in second-hand coats and delivery uniforms, in law school debt and prosecutorial isolation, who decided that truth was worth more than the careers they had been told to protect. If you've ever been invisible in a room full of power, if you've ever chosen to look when looking cost everything, if you've ever loved someone through the pressure that should have crushed you, this was for you. The emotional scar remains. Trust is harder now, intimacy requires more negotiation, and the victory is tempered by what was sacrificed to achieve it. But the love that survived is earned, not given, and the justice that arrived imperfect, partial, really is more valuable for having been fought for rather than granted. If this story moved you, if you saw yourself in Sienna's exhaustion or Harrison's guardedness or even Porter's terrifying certainty that money could purchase reality, then join this community of people who believe that seeing clearly is still possible. Like this video not for the algorithm, but for the acknowledgement that these stories matter. Comment with your own moment of choosing truth over convenience, not for engagement, but for the record that we are not alone in these choices. Share this with someone who needs to remember that power reversals, while rare, are real, and that the poorest person in the building might hold the secret that brings the entire system into question. Subscribe and enable notifications not for content, but for community, for the next story, the next investigation, the next moment when fiction illuminates the machinery we navigate daily. The next video drops in 14 days. It will be about the hospital, where the same dynamics play out with different costumes, where the stakes are life itself rather than narrative. Until then, keep looking. Keep choosing to see. And remember that the humiliation you survive